let's compare the careers of Alexander Povetkin and Luis Ortiz and see who has the best resume and who's the most accomplished amateur and pro. So let's start off here on Luis Ortiz's BoxRec page and slide on down to his amateur highlights. Now, in amateur boxing, the two biggest and most prestigious tournaments are the World Championships and the Olympic Games. So any amateur with serious aspirations is looking to try and win one of those tournaments, if not both, and at the very least, get some type of medal at one of those tournaments, even if it's not gold. Now, Luis Ortiz was amateur for a very, very long time, as is typical with Cubans. He had nearly 360 amateur fights. But in all those years as an amateur, he never even managed to qualify for the Olympic Games, much less win any type of medal there. He did qualify for the World Championships once in 2005, but he only made it to the quarterfinals. He never got a medal. And in fact, he was actually stopped by a guy called Alexander Povetkin in 3 rounds. You can actually watch that fight on YouTube. So for the majority of Luis Ortiz's amateur career, he was involved in national tournaments in Cuba. He did win a regional tournament, which is the Pan American Games in 2005. You can see there, won a gold medal. That's the highlight of his amateur career. Now, the Pan American Championships is the equivalent of the European or the Commonwealth Championships, something like that. It's a regional tournament, but he never managed to, win a medal at either of the two most prestigious and major amateur tournaments where all of the best fighters from all over the world come and compete. Okay. Now, if we compare that to Alexander Povetkin's amateur career, it's very different. In fact, before we do that, I have to highlight that Luis Ortiz competed at 200 pounds in all of the international tournaments he was involved in. 200 pounds is the equivalent of cruiserweight in the professional game. Okay. So he was essentially a cruiserweight for his international amateur days. Alexander Povetkin competed at super heavyweight. Okay. So he was the weight division above Luis Ortiz in the amateurs. And as you can see from his amateur highlights, Povetkin won just about everything. Well, I think he did win all the major tournaments. He won the European Championships here, as you can see, gold in 2002. He won the World Championships. You can see there in Thailand, gold in 2003. Won the European Championships again in 2004, gold. And of course, he won the Olympics in Athens in Greece in 2004, gold. So Povetkin, from a credentials point of view, from an achievements point of view as an amateur, it's night and day between him and Luis Ortiz. There have been some people on the internet running around claiming that Luis Ortiz was an Olympian. There is absolutely zero evidence to suggest that Luis Ortiz ever even qualified for the Olympics. I've seen no evidence of it anywhere. It's certainly not listed here on BoxRec. It's not in his Wikipedia page. I found nothing anywhere to say that Luis Ortiz was ever in the Olympics. Whereas Povetkin, you can go watch him competing in many of these international amateur tournaments, certainly the Olympics. There may well be footage of him winning the World Championships as well. So he was on another level to Luis Ortiz as an amateur. And again, both guys were amateur for a long time. Ortiz was actually amateur for longer than Povetkin in terms of the fact he had a lot more fights at least. Povetkin had just over 130 fights. Ortiz had over 350, nearly 360 fights, but yet he didn't achieve anywhere near as much as Povetkin did. So that is some indication of the quality of fighter we're talking about here. Povetkin was a much better quality amateur than Luis Ortiz. If achievements count for anything. I know in the eyes of some people, apparently achievements don't mean anything, but in the eyes of anybody sensible, you realize that this amateur record is far less impressive than this one. All right, moving on over to their professional accomplishments. So first of all, with Luis Ortiz. So early on in his career, he was fighting, the usual journeyman that most professionals do when they start off. He was able to defeat, where are we at now? Monty Barrett, who was a very washed up, basically a journeyman by the point he fought Luis Ortiz, but he did stop him in 4. I remember that fight. He fought Latif Kayade, who a cruiserweight moving up, and that's where Ortiz actually tested positive for steroids after the Latif Kaede fight. That was for the interim WBA title. Tested positive for steroids after that, receives, I think, a 6-month ban, and then, was started fighting again, or started fighting in WBA sanctioned contests again. But again, Latif Kaede, who is he? He's fought, he was a cruiserweight moving up, hasn't done anything at cruiserweight, hasn't done anything at heavyweight. He's really a nobody with the greatest of respect in boxing. Brian Jennings in 2015, 5 years ago, that was Luis Ortiz's best performance. At this stage, Luis Ortiz showed some real potential in the Brian Jennings fight. But since that time, there's nothing that Luis Ortiz has done. It's very quick to go through Luis Ortiz's professional career and point out the highlights, because there really aren't many highlights. There's the Brian Jennings fight, and there's really nothing else. He did beat a very, very over-the-hill Tony Thompson, but that's not really much of a highlight. Brian Jennings was a live opponent when he went in with him. He beat him in 7 rounds in a very good performance. But since then, before and since, absolutely nothing. He's fought the likes of, Tony Thompson, a washed-up Malise Scott, Dave Allen, Daniel Martz. And of course, he lost to Deontay Wilder a couple times. And that's it. There really isn't much to highlight. Now, Alexander Povetkin, he doesn't have an all-time great record as a professional, far from it. If anything, Povetkin's a little bit of an underachiever as a pro, truth be told. But nonetheless, if you compare his resume to Luis Ortiz's, it's a lot better. So first of all, he defeated Chris Bird, who's obviously a former world heavyweight champion, in 2007. Now, Bird had lost 3 times by then and had a draw, but he still had a little bit something left at the time. After defeating former world heavyweight champion Chris Bird, he took on Eddie Chambers. Now, Chambers was 30-0 at the time. Chambers was, at that time, the best American heavyweight around. He'd beaten, Calvin Brock and Sam Peter and all that kind of stuff, and he was, viewed as the best American heavyweight. In fact, Chambers actually beat a number of the top Americans after the Povetkin fight as well. But Povetkin did manage to beat Eddie Chambers on a unanimous decision, so that was a good performance for Povetkin at the time. He went on to, what's the next notable fight here? He beat Ruslan Chigayev. Of course, Ruslan Chigayev was a world heavyweight champion at least once in his career. Did he hold the world heavyweight championship twice? I know he held it at least once. And Povetkin won that fight on a unanimous decision over 12. Marco Huck was obviously a long-reigning cruiserweight champion who stepped up to fight Povetkin, and he gave Povetkin a real tough fight, actually. Real tough fight that time. But he did manage to defeat Marco Huck on a majority decision. Washed up Hasim Ratman. That doesn't really count for much. The loss to Vladimir Klitschko. He went to 12 rounds. And, he tried his best, but Klitschko was leaning all over him, fouling him to death, as well as punching him in the head with very hard shots. And he lost that on a UD. He then came back and beat Manuel Charr. Now, Manuel Charr at the time, his only loss was to Vitaly Klitschko. And he was a live guy. I'm not saying Manuel Charr was ever a particularly good fighter. He hasn't been. But he was certainly a brave guy and a guy who would come to bring it. You saw that in the Vitaly Klitschko fight. But against Povetkin, who seemed to have a point to prove after he lost to Klitschko, he was wiped out in 7 rounds. That was actually a brutal knockout. One of the most brutal knockouts of Povetkin's career was the Manuel Charr win. Brutal, brutal knockout. He then went on to fight Carlos Takam. Again, Takam at the time only 1 loss. Takam was boxing well. It was a real competitive fight. But in the end, Takam was knocked out very, very badly in the 10th round of that fight. Again, highlight reel KO for any of you who want to go and see that. If anything, Povetkin produced the best form of his career after the Klitschko loss. It seemed to light a fire underneath him. He then went on to take on Mike Perez, who was a decent Cuban, talented Cuban. Perez, to be fair, might not have been in the best place mentally going into this fight because of the Abdul Salamov thing, and also apparently he was having issues with drinking and his conditioning wasn't the best. But nonetheless, Povetkin went in there and took care of business, knocked out Mike Perez in 1 round. I mean, most of us expected this to be a pretty interesting and entertaining fight, but it was over before it started. Povetkin just blasted him out in one. He then became the second man to defeat Mariusz Wach. Again, Mariusz Wach, not an amazing heavyweight, but Wach had only lost once to Klitschko. He took everything Klitschko had to throw at him, except the kitchen sink, and he was the first man to stop Mariusz Wach. Klitschko couldn't stop him. Povetkin did in the final round. Then took on Johan Duopa. Now, Duopa was underprepared for the fight. Let's not even play about with that. He was underprepared, but nonetheless, he did knock out Johan Duopa in 6 rounds cleanly, whereas I think Duopa went, was it 10 or 11 with Wilder? Fought Rudenko, got a decision over him. Christian Hammer, these are not particularly impressive wins here. In the latter stages of his career, Rudenko, Hammer, they're wins at the end of the day, but they're not particularly impressive. David Price, he knocked out. Then, of course, he suffered his second loss to Anthony Joshua and has rebounded since with a win over Hughie Fury and that split decision draw with Michael Hunter. So again, there's far more highlights in Povetkin's professional career. He's beaten far better fighters than Luis Ortiz has. He's got far more world champions, etc. on his record than Luis Ortiz has. So although Povetkin's professional career is nowhere near as impressive as his amateur career, it's still better than Luis Ortiz's. You would have to be on a different type of crack or crystal meth to say otherwise. It is what it is. People have agendas, but if you respect facts and if you respect the truth, then there is no other conclusion to come to than Alexander Povetkin is a far more proven fighter, amateur and pro, with a far better resume than Luis Ortiz. They've never fought each other, and styles do make fights, so you never know. Even though Povetkin's way more accomplished than Ortiz, perhaps Ortiz has got a style to beat him. Maybe. But if you're looking at their track records, amateur and pro, both guys in their primes, you would probably have to favor Povetkin. Yeah, based upon what they've achieved. Povetkin's fought plenty of southpaws in his amateur days. As a professional, I can't remember if he's fought southpaws as a pro. Did he fight any southpaws? Certainly in the amateurs, you're not going to get away from fighting pro. Yeah, he did, of course, fight Mike Perez, who was a southpaw in the pros. I'm trying to look for some others here. Ruslan Chigayev, of course, another southpaw. He fought him, beat him. There may have been one or two others. So, yeah, the guy's no stranger to southpaws, and he's also no stranger to Cubans, because during the time of communism, the Russians and the Cubans would often match their fighters against each other, and they would actually swap training tactics and training tips because they were comrades, right, during the height of communism. So, yeah, it's night and day, their careers. All these propaganda meisters out there spinning false narratives, claiming that Ortiz and Alexander Povetkin are somehow on an even keel in terms of their achievements, amateur and pro. These people are either totally ignorant, and it doesn't take much. You can easily go over to even one of their BoxRec pages and find out information about their amateur and pro careers. It doesn't take much. So these people are either ignorant or they're willfully spreading lies when they're trying to make out that as though these two fighters are on the same kind of level in terms of resume and achievement. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.